that's what I get for telling Sean that he could introduce me however he liked. Because Sean is such an absolutely dictatorial timekeeper, I've noticed that not very many of the speakers have actually taken the time to thank the organisers for putting on such an awesome conference. So I thought I'd gratuitously do that. All right, so this is going to be sort of, well, I mean, I suppose there are a couple of people in the audience who haven't seen any of the talks I've given in the past, so I will be giving a sort of abbreviated version of some of what I usually say, but I'll get on to some rather newer stuff later on. First of all, I guess quite a lot of you may still think that I work for the Methuselah Foundation. The Methuselah Foundation actually split in two about 6 months ago, so it now is more or less restricted to doing what it was set up to do, namely the mouse prizes for mouse longevity, and all of our research activities have been divested into this new foundation, which I am the Chief Science Officer of now, so that explains the affiliation. Okay, so as Sean said, I work on aging. I'm not in favour of it. I'm doing my best to do something about it. And this is the way that I like to define what the problem is, the nature of the problem. Aging is this rather sort of inevitable, really, side effect of being alive in the first place. Metabolism, which is the word I'm going to use to encompass all of the biochemical and cellular processes that go on in our bodies all the time to keep us alive, progressively lays down various types of molecular and cellular damage, which are harmless for an awfully long time, but eventually when there's enough damage, it gets in the way of metabolism and starts to cause dysfunction of the human body, which is, I'm going to use the word pathology to encompass. So in terms of doing anything about all of that, traditionally we've had this sort of scenario where people have either taken what I'm calling the geriatrics approach of waiting until people get reasonably elderly and things start to go wrong, and then trying to attack those pathologies and slow down their progression. And that's better than nothing, I suppose. And then there are the gerontologists who take the view that, well, prevention is better than cure, and the thing to do is to actually clean up metabolism in the first place and just slow down the rate at which it creates these various eventually pathogenic types of molecular and cellular change. And, of course, there are problems with both of these approaches. The problem with the geriatrics approach is something you definitely don't need to be a biologist to understand. Aging is very chaotic and miserable and messy, and all of these things happen and lots more besides, and they exacerbate each other, and it's all rather a mess. And, of course, because one's intervening so late in the chain of events, it's, you know, the precursors of the target that the geriatrician is aiming at are continuing to accumulate. The geriatrician's job is intrinsically getting harder and harder as time goes on. So effectively what we're saying is that the geriatrician's approach is better than nothing, yes, but it's not much better than nothing, and it can never be much better than nothing. We've got to do something much more different from that if we want to have a radical impact on postponing aging. However, the gerontology approach doesn't look all that much more promising, unfortunately, because of this, the fact that metabolism is rather complicated. This is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works, and that's bad enough. But, of course, the really bad news is that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works, and that is completely dwarfed, as any biologist will tell you, by the astronomical amount that we don't know about how it works, even completely ignoring all the presumably even more astronomical amount that we don't even know that we don't know. So the question is, what can we do about all this? And is there another approach? And, of course, if I didn't think the word, then I wouldn't be here. Ultimately, I feel that we can get a lot of hints about what to do about aging by looking at simple man-made machines. All we have to do is take the very straightforward observation that the human body is a machine, albeit an extraordinarily complicated one, and therefore to say that the way in which we might extend its healthy lifespan, its functioning lifespan, beyond what we might call its warranty period, may be derivable by looking at how we already successfully extend the lifespans of simple man-made machines. So here's a car which was built with an unusually long warranty period. It's 50 years old, this car, and that's because it was built that way. It's got obviously corrosion-resistant metal and tough tires and all that sort of stuff. But the point of this slide is the title. Why have I mentioned VW bugs? Of course, the reason I've mentioned them is simply because there are just as many 50-year-old VW bugs driving around the streets of the USA as there are 50-year-old Land Rovers. And that's not because they were built to last. It's because they've got this other thing called style, which has caused their owners to fall in love with them and to do an exceptionally thorough job of maintaining them. So essentially, cars like this car was built in the same year as the one on the previous slide, are an existence proof that maintenance works just so long as you do it thoroughly enough. And if we now come back to the human body, this motivates a completely different third approach to combating aging, which I like to call the maintenance approach. What we're doing here, of course, is we're saying that we do need to actually be preemptive about aging. We need to intervene at a point that is not too late in the game, and that's what we're doing here. We're trying to actually fix the damage that's been created before it translates into pathology. But we don't want to intervene so early in the game as to run up against our ignorance about how the body works. The key thing about the maintenance approach is that we're letting metabolism do what it normally does and lay down these various types of molecular and cellular damage at the rate that it naturally lays them down, rather than trying to slow that down. If we do that, then of course we don't actually need to understand metabolism particularly well. All we need to do is actually characterize the consequences, the damage itself, and figure out ways to repair the damage. Furthermore, the repair doesn't have to be perfect. If we can repair this damage reasonably well, periodically, then we end up being able to postpone, substantially maybe, the age at which there is enough damage to cause things to start going wrong, to cause pathology. So that is the approach that I decided maybe 9 years ago seemed very promising in terms of quite substantially extending human healthy life in the foreseeable future, unlike the other two approaches. And that's the approach that I and my foundation have been pursuing ever since. The real reason why I felt it was appropriate to go this way was because not only did I feel that this was a good way of describing the problem and the most promising solution, but also because one could actually go into some detail in describing the nature of that solution. So on the left-hand side here in the left-hand column, we have a list of 7 types of damage. And the first conclusion that I came to, which has got me into a certain amount of trouble over the years, is that this is actually an exhaustive list of all of the things that go wrong. Everything that qualifies as damage by this definition, these intermediates, if you like, between metabolism and pathology, they all fit into one or other of these 7 categories. And of course, these are big categories. I'm not saying they're not, but they are useful categories. And the reason they're useful is because of the column on the right, which is a description, well, not exactly a description, just a list of the types of approach that we might use to actually address these types of damage. And when I say address, I do mean, in general, reverse rather than merely slow down the progression of. In some cases, I mean obviate, in other words, essentially stop them from having a contribution to pathology rather than stopping them from happening. However, the point is these things are all very specific types of therapy. In some cases, they're things that we're already pretty close to doing. The first 2 on this list, that's certainly true. These things are in some ways in clinical trials, in some examples. The ones towards the end are much harder, but not ridiculously much harder. On the time frame that interests people in this room, we're looking at time frames that are actually quite modest. Perhaps less than 10 years before we get to a point of proof of concept in the laboratory and actually get all these things to work in mice. And to some extent, we can say that that's really what we need to care about, because ultimately, once we've got a sufficiently persuasive proof of concept in terms of postponing age-related ill health in a laboratory mammal, then the scientific community are going to be persuaded that this is a realistic approach to combating aging and that it's going to work for humans in due course. And they won't want to say how long it's going to take. Most of them are going to be too cowardly to say things like that. But basically, the fact is they're going to acknowledge that it's only a matter of time, and all hell is going to break loose in terms of changed priorities, in terms of spending on making sure it happens sooner rather than later. All right, so I've given you a couple of reasons why the maintenance approach is such a good idea. I've shown you, first of all, that it's the weak link. Damage is the weak link in the process going from being alive to being dead, and that allows us to attack aging in a much more plausible way than the other 2 approaches. I've also shown you that we can characterize damage quite simply. We can classify all the things that really count as damage, or, I mean, you have to take my word for it, you understand, but we can classify them all into just these 7 classes, in contrast to the extraordinary complexity that we see in both the consequences of damage, in other words, pathology, and also the causes of damage, namely metabolism. But the thing I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes is the third thing I've written down here, which is the sense in which we buy time this way. If you take someone who's 60 years old and you slow down the rate at which they are accumulating further damage, then they're still getting older. They're still biologically 60 and then 65 and then 70, and even if you halve the rate of damage, you're only buying a little bit of time. But if you are even moderately capable of reversing the damage and actually implementing bona fide rejuvenation to take these people back to a younger biological age, then you're buying a hell of a lot more time. You can imagine, for example, taking someone back from being 60 to being biologically 40, shall we say. It's going to take another 20 years, maybe longer, before they get back to being biologically 60. And that's a nice long time. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because of the progress of technology. Obviously, we've heard a lot yesterday and today about the progress of technology. And I am going to give you some flavor for the way I think about the progress of technology in respect of combating aging. So this is obviously extremely schematic. I'm just really getting a concept across here. Don't draw anything quantitative out of this for the moment anyway. What I'm saying here is that the red line is simply normal aging. It denotes normal aging, in other words, a steady decline in how long it's going to be before things start going wrong. I use the word damage to describe the accumulating problems. Here I'm using the word reserve, which is simply the reciprocal of damage, the amount of additional damage that you can afford to accumulate before things start going badly wrong. The frailty threshold here, this dotted line, is what I'm using to denote the point at which pathologies start to emerge. So the red line is normal aging. You start off at age 0 with not much damage, lots of reserve, and you can see what happens. Then when you've got therapies of the sort that I've described so far, you can imagine something denoted by the pink line, where we take someone in middle age, let's say 60 years old, we fix part of their damage. And when I say part, of course, I mean some proportion of all of the various types of damage. We can't afford to leave any of the types of damage completely unaddressed. But we fix up a respectable proportion, let's say half, of the damage that this person's accumulated. Just like that. Now, we're not affecting the rate at which damage is created. So after the therapy has been applied, the individual starts accumulating damage at the same rate as normal, so that's why the slope is the same as the red line. But of course, we can apply the therapy again a second time and a third time and so on, and that's what's shown here. Now, we are seeing, of course, a bit of a problem there, namely diminishing returns. And the reason we're seeing diminishing returns is fairly obvious from this depiction of the situation, namely that we've got all this difficult damage that the therapy doesn't work on that's continuing to accumulate unabated, and that damage is eventually on its own going to be abundant enough, however thoroughly we're knocking off the easy damage, abundant enough to tip our hero over the frailty threshold and cause the emergence and progression of pathology. So that's why we get only that much. And when I say here 30 years of extra life, which is the sort of amount that I think we can reasonably expect to achieve using the therapies that I think we can develop in maybe the next 25 years, then that's the sort of thing I mean. However, as we all know, 20 years or so is a long time in technology, and it's not just a long time from now to the point where we get to robust human rejuvenation, the achievement of this 30-year lifespan. It's also a long time thereafter. If we look at this line that I've drawn, the pink line, the interval between the first and second applications of these therapies may indeed be something as much as 20 years, certainly 15 years or so. And that is enough time that we can very confidently expect a significant improvement in the quality of the technologies that are being used to rejuvenate these people. So, in fact, what we're going to see, obviously, is a variety of different types of improvement in convenience and cost and so on, but also in comprehensiveness. We're going to be able to have therapies at this point with extremely high probability that not only fix up the types of damage that they had before, but also fix up some proportion, maybe half, of the damage that could not be fixed 20 years previously. So that's why this orange line shows a greater degree of rejuvenation. Now, of course, the obvious and very important property of what I'm showing you here is that the orange line here goes up not only to a higher point than the pink line would have done, but also to a higher point than the pink line 20 years previously went. In other words, these people are being more thoroughly rejuvenated the second time around, even though the problem of rejuvenating them is intrinsically harder. In other words, there's a higher proportion of difficult damage than there was the first time round. Now, of course, it's obvious that that iterates, that you just don't hit diminishing returns this way. You can just keep going and indefinitely have a situation where the patient or the individual is getting biologically younger as they're getting chronologically older. So this is why we come up with the idea of indefinite extension of lifespan using these rejuvenation therapies. And of course, there is a simple property of what I'm showing you here, a necessary rate, a minimum necessary rate at which these technologies need to be improved in terms of their comprehensiveness in order that the general trend is upwards rather than downwards. And that rate of improvement that's required is what I've been calling longevity escape velocity. There's the definition of it. The rate at which these therapies must be improved following that initial breakthrough that gives us maybe a 50% repair capability in order to stay one step ahead of the problem. All right, so the term longevity escape velocity has been around for a few years now. I think I first used it in about 2004. About 18 months ago, a friend of mine, Paul Hynek, said that it was time I gave a name to the point at which we reach longevity escape velocity. And as I will shortly be explaining, it's very likely that there will only be one such point. In other words, that when we reach it, it's exceptionally unlikely that we'll ever fall below it again. And so he said that you should call it the Methuselarity. And I think that's rather a nice name. So here it is. So for the purposes of today, since obviously all of you are very familiar with the singularity, I thought it would be interesting to compare and contrast these two things and to identify some interesting conclusions from doing so. First of all, is the Methuselarity likely to happen? Is longevity escape velocity a realistic rate of progress? Well, of course it's realistic. I mean, if we look at the... if we look at the rate of progress that we typically see for new technologies, then we see that there's a fundamental distinction between a very profound distinction between the predictability of achievement of timeframes for achievement of fundamental breakthroughs like powered flight, for example, as opposed to the achievement of incremental refinements of those breakthroughs thereafter. So a lot of people were wrong about how long it would take to get in the air. Probably Leonardo da Vinci thought it would only be 20 years. But a lot of people were right thereafter. Once the Wright brothers got off the ground, progress was rapid and smooth. And of course, we all know that things more or less ground to a halt in 1969, and we haven't got flying cars. But we also know why, namely, we can't be bothered. The transport is good enough, and the public pressure isn't there. So this is pretty reassuring. And of course, we can look at lots of other technologies and get the same sort of message. In order to get a slightly more direct answer to this question, a couple of years ago, I did a little software project with someone well known to this audience, Chris Phoenix, who used to be part of the Center for Responsible Nanotechnology. And we did a simulation of aging built on the concept of aging as this accumulation of damage. And to cut a very long story short, this is the sort of answer we got. That if you don't have these therapies, if you have no therapies, you have a distribution of ages at death that looks like this. This is a survival curve. So in other words, it shows that at age 0, everyone's alive in some cohort. Not many of them die until age 50. Then they start dropping like flies, and hardly any of them get beyond 100. If you start applying these therapies late, like at age 80, when half the people are already dead, then this is what happens, the blue line. That's why the blue line and the black line are coincident until here. And not much benefit is seen because these people are frail, and being frail is risky, and they just take a long time to be pulled back from the brink, and there just isn't time. The likelihood of their dying in the meantime is too high. But if people are only 10 years younger than that, 70 years old when the therapies are initiated, then things will look rather brighter. We get the same deal for a while, but eventually we get bona fide rejuvenation to a point where risk of death from aging goes down quite substantially. These graphs are only showing death from aging, not death from being hit by trucks and so on. And so maybe 15% of these people reach the age of 150, by which time things are looking very rosy indeed, and by the time people get out to 200, which about 10% of them do, their risk of death from aging is the same as young adults, in other words, essentially 0. If you're 10 years younger than that and you start these therapies at age 60, then nearly half of you get through. And I want to point out that this is actually just one run of the simulation, and it was a particularly conservative, particularly pessimistic one, in the sense that I was looking at the possibility where the therapies that I'm talking about double in their efficacy only every 42 years. Now, I mean, for crying out loud, 42 years, that's the time between Lindbergh and Concord. So, I mean, saying it's only going to be a doubling is obviously completely crazily pessimistic, and yet it's still abundantly good enough to achieve this thing called longevity escape velocity. So, okay, let's compare and contrast a little bit. We know that the Singularity talks about accelerating change. You know, whether it's exponential or not is really not the big deal here. The Methuselarity is actually different. It turns out that things can decelerate, that you can take longer to actually get things to happen. And so you may think, well, maybe that's true in terms of the result, but maybe it's not true in terms of the difficulty of achieving the result. Well, actually, it turns out that the rate at which we need to improve the therapies also goes down. What I'm showing here is a corresponding situation to the previous graph, but in this case, we fix half the damage the first time round, but the second time, rather than fixing half the remaining damage, we only fix a third of it. And the third time, we only fix a quarter of the remaining damage, and so on. And as you can see, it's still good enough, so that's pretty cool. This is an example, again, from simple man-made machines to show that this is realistic. Here's a car that's not 50 years old. It's actually more than 100 years old, and it's doing fine. And the key thing here is not only is it, it's getting lots of maintenance, of course, but it's getting the same amount of maintenance that it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago when it was only 3 or 4 times as old as it was designed to be. So longevity escape velocity for cars is already more or less 0. So this is the sort of thing that has historically got me into trouble as a consequence, as a conclusion based on what I've been telling you, that in order to get 150-year-old people, we're going to have to get this robust human rejuvenation, because 122 is the current world record for longevity. But after that, the easy part's over, and people who are not much younger are going to be able to live indefinitely, and you get numbers like 1,000 by looking at the risk of death that young adults have today in the developed world. So this gets me into trouble, but I've got rather bored of being lambasted for this, so I'm going to give people something else to lambast me for. I've told you a bit about this, but let's make a contrast here between the Singularity and the Methuselarity. In terms of what the technology that we have can actually do, the Singularity is clearly a much more dramatic event, where computing technology goes from a period of gradual, albeit mildly accelerating, increases in functionality, just suddenly goes asymptotic, goes through the roof in a very, very short amount of time. Whereas in the Methuselarity, we're talking about a very steady progress and modest progress in improving the technologies that we have to rejuvenate people. In terms of the human impact, however, it's the other way around. The Methuselarity has this massive effect, obviously, where we go from a steady increase in longevity of people of different ages to suddenly everything going, again, pretty much indefinite, just more or less overnight. Whereas the Singularity is probably not going to be like that, so long as we get it right, of course, so long as it's a friendly Singularity. Computers are already fading into the background as much as possible. Computers don't behave like computers from the point of view of people who used computers 30 years ago, and they're gradually becoming more and more usable, less and less effort, so to speak. And the Singularity, I think we can probably say, will be a case of things just moving a little bit further into the background and just making our lives easy without having to think about them. So it may actually not really have much human impact. So what this tells me is, if there are 2 dimensions here in which these 2 things have different rank order, then probably there's some synergy to be had. And I think there is, because it comes down to risk aversion. I know I've only got 2 minutes. I might take 3 minutes because I was so nice to Sean early on. Of course, risk aversion is bad. I showed you some graphs that had nothing to do with being hit by trucks, but the fact is we're not going to be terribly fond of being hit by trucks when there's nothing else that we're dying of, and obviously infectious diseases and all the other things that kill young people. I have a feeling we might actually want to act on this. About 10 years ago, I predicted that driving would be outlawed. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that we're just going to make really safe cars. Brad Templeton said a few things about that before lunch. But the key point is that we're going to have tools with which to do this. We're going to be able to throw money and resources at this. And if the Singularity happens as well, we're going to have pretty much infinitely powerful tools to throw at this. What that means is a couple of things. First of all, it means that uploading will be completely pointless, because it's going to be perfectly safe to be made out of squishy stuff. But it also means this. It means that for more or less any n you choose, subject to the heat death of the universe, 1,000 is nothing. You know, we're just going to be able to bear down on other causes of death, all other causes of death, as fast as we like, and that's going to be rather fast indeed. So I feel that the difference in age of birth between the first 150-year-old and the first 1,000-year-old will be small, but the difference between the first 1,000-year-old and the first million-year-old or billion-year-old is probably going to be even smaller. I just thought I'll stop there and just mention that you can get my book outside, which was published a couple of years ago and which is still reasonably up to date about the detailed biology of all this, though it is written for a non-technical audience. And of course, we're a foundation. We'd like your time, we'd like your money, and I'll stop there. And I believe I have exactly 1 minute for questions.
Okay. Question. Jeffrey West of the Santa Fe Institute, among others, have talked about the scalability of biological principles to use, for example, metabolism to measure or to model cities. What principles, if any, do you derive from your work at the individual level to the societal level for the longevity, escape velocity of civilizations, etc.?
This is a very hard question to answer. Certainly there's lots and lots of good work by people like Jeffrey West, as you say, talking about the way that aging works naturally, as well as the way that other aspects of life work naturally. But of course, when one starts applying technology to this, all bets are off. We can't say that the warranty period, so to speak, of an individual actually tells us anything about what we can do biomedically. And really, you know, to be honest, I don't have a good answer to your question. I don't think there's any sort of basic paradigm that we can bring out of the history of technology, for example. We can really only get hints of the sort that I gave by comparing previous technologies in this two-phase form where you have the fundamental breakthrough, which is hard to predict the time frame of, followed by the incremental refinements, which are easier to predict. That's about as far as one can go, I think, in defining broad principles of this technology. I think I've got time for one more.
Can you talk a bit about what you believe the psychological effects of such extraordinary lifespan would be? How does, and there's sort of a disease model for that as well. How
yeah, okay, so yeah, the psychological effects. Well, I don't really think that there is anything to worry about here, for two reasons. Number one, it's important to remember that the psychological effect that will happen suddenly is only the anticipation of a high probability of living a long time. So that might alter one's, the ways in which one has one's priorities, whether one bothers to have a pension, things like that, but it won't really alter very much in terms of fundamental psychology, I don't think. Psychology may indeed alter, given that we don't know much about how the brain works, as we progressively get older, but it's only going to alter 1 year at a time, and we don't know anything about what's going to happen, so we're just going to have to watch it and see what goes on. However, also, I think we have to always bear in mind that this technological change will happen in the context of all manner of other technological changes, some of which will be considerably more dramatic more suddenly, and therefore, that makes it even less possible to predict what's actually going to happen. I have not been told to stop, so...
Okay. So, very good. What are you doing to ensure your own immortality, as that would be considerable brand destruction were it to happen?
Yeah, well, I'm coming here and getting people interested. Not that you're not interested already. No, I mean, seriously, I don't really focus on myself, except insofar as I wear a seatbelt in the back seat. I don't accept seminar invitations to dangerous countries, things like that. Because I do think it's important to make sure that I carry on maximizing my impact on this mission, certainly. In terms of avoiding aging, however, I do basically nothing. First of all, because I'm lucky, I'm genetically well built, I'm aging very slowly as it is, thank you very much. And secondly, because ultimately I have to have a fairly punishing, brutal lifestyle traveling all over the world all the time, which is probably shortening my life, but I figure I'm making more of a difference than that by the extent to which I'm hastening the defeat of aging. Plus also, I really care more about people in general than about myself, because I'm only going to be making a small difference by my own work to my probability of benefiting personally.
Thanks a lot, Aubrey.